Welcome to episode 5. If you're like most people I know, then at least once you've had this kind of experience. You're tired, but you frequently can't fall asleep or get back to sleep because your mind is just going 90 miles a minute. And it goes on for days thinking about the conflict with your boss or your overflowing inbox or other stressful life experience. Or maybe you want to work out, but you find yourself consistently too tired to actually do anything but sit on the couch with popcorn and a glass of wine or several. So when these things get chronic, you could actually be headed for a burnout crisis because of the way your body and your hormones react to stress. So today on the episode, we're going to talk about what stress does in your body. Some people have this idea that stress is all a mental thing. I'm going to show you today how many and wide-reaching are the physical aspects and the physical effects that are caused by stress, and particularly how, even if you don't have a thyroid disease, stress triggers changes that can leave you exhausted and hypothyroid in ways that do not show on a standard blood test. The good news is that these issues are treatable, and it may actually be easier than you think. So let's get started. Now, if you really want to geek out on this topic, I am also recording a video version of this podcast that will be released on my blog. So you can come take a look at that at www.danagibbsmd.com/blog. You're listening to the Beyond the Thyroid podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dana Gibbs. I'm an ENT surgeon and hormone specialist. For years, I struggled with my own unrecognized thyroid problems before and even after I was regularly performing thyroid surgeries. Then, one day, I learned something that turned my health around and opened my eyes to the limits of mainstream medicine in treating more subtle thyroid abnormalities. I spent the next 20 years fine-tuning my hormone expertise in disorders like Hashimoto's disease, perimenopause, and stress-related illness. Come join me as I share this new approach to hormones that empowers you to take control of your own thyroid and hormone imbalances. Let's dive in. Hello there. Today I am excited to share with you a topic that comes up all the time in my medical practice. I am Dr. Dana Gibbs, and I run a thyroid, Hashimoto's, and hormone balancing practice. So the topic is stress. So chronic fatigue and exhaustion, and I'm not talking just about a little tired, is one of the main problems people come to me for help with. Not surprising as it is the number one symptom of hypothyroidism. So when we investigate in depth, many times, the signs and the test results lead us back to stress for these people. And the more prolonged their stress is, the more pronounced and persistent their reaction tends to get, including things like suppressing your thyroid function. So that you may start feeling many of those symptoms that I talked about in episode 3. So people who are under stress can get all kinds of crazy symptoms that fail to elicit any physical diagnosis of any kind, only to have the symptoms disappear when they remove themselves from the source of the stress. So I like Martha Beck. In her book, The Way of Integrity, she describes developing these mysterious all-over pains so severe that she couldn't move, confusion and brain fog and binge eating and feeling out of control and suicidal. She got into that state because of the severe psychological stress that she was under, as she basically was living a double life. So she was the perfect Mormon at home and the perfect academic atheist at her job at Harvard. And her symptoms defied mainstream medicine's ability to fix or even diagnose what was wrong until she gave up both of those personas and discovered her life's true calling, as she puts it. So when that happened, her symptoms disappeared as suddenly and as mysteriously as they had come. So reading that story now, I can only imagine the high cortisol and thyroid imbalances she must have been under. She was lucky that finding her true purpose allowed these things to abate because, as you will see in a few minutes, not everyone who gets into that kind of situation is so lucky. Some people can get stuck in a spiral and need specialized medical help to get out. So, what do we mean by stress? Stress is literally anything that our primitive brain sees as a threat to our survival. The stress reaction evolved really early in human history when we were not at the top of the food chain. So there's acute stress running from the tiger is the cliche, but there's also chronic stress like food scarcity, war, slavery, being exiled. They might not kill you today, but you are definitely going to die, and pretty soon. And pay attention to this being exiled thing, because I'll be coming back to it in a second. So when stress arises, our body reacts in a predictable way through our hormones. And the more prolonged the stress is, the more pronounced and persistent that reaction gets. And these responses help us survive when we're threatened. So what kinds of stress are there? There's really three kinds of stress. Stress can be external, caused by physical danger, like violence or a near miss on the freeway, but it can also be physical, like pain or malnutrition, inadequate sleep, inflammation, illness, or even overexercising. The third kind of stress is situational. Modern first world circumstances like public speaking. And many of these actually tend to be really chronic. So work pressure, relationship stress, and the always on nature of our current society. The other thing is we humans are the only species that have evolved the ability to worry about stuff that we can't control or that might not even happen. So chronic worries about your health or the economy or life events like, what if I get fired and can't pay my bills? So the worry results in just as much stress as if the bad situation was actually happening to you. Unfortunately, studies show your body literally can't tell the difference between these and events that literally threaten our lives. The reaction is exactly the same. So let's look at this stress reaction. So when stress arises, our body acts in a predictable physical way by rapidly releasing adrenaline, which is a neurotransmitter, and the hormone cortisol, which is the hormone. And it works like this. So it starts up here with the circumstance. So let's call our circumstance tiger, our cliche again, and we'll use him as an example. So our brains instantly analyze and compare the situation with past experience and come up with thoughts about the danger. The tiger's after me, I might die, which triggers an emotion, fear. Interestingly, it's a few specific negative emotions that when they arise, trigger the stress response in our brains. So that emotion goes to certain parts of our brain and instantaneously releases the signal for adrenaline via nerve impulses. And also, when adrenaline hits your bloodstream, it gives you instant energy to act, to get away, or to fight if you can. So that's for the first few seconds, and then cortisol takes over. So what also happens after the release of the adrenaline is the release of a trophic hormone. And this is a signaling hormone from your brain to your bloodstream, and it goes in your bloodstream to the adrenal glands and causes the release of cortisol. And that happens within 30 seconds. So adrenaline and cortisol together trigger rapid physical effects. So let's go with another example. A bug crawls across your foot. It also starts with a thought, spider, and then ew, which is the emotion of disgust cropping up, and you scramble to get away and you end that poor spider's life. So disgust is another one of those 5 specific emotions here that trigger our survival instincts and are involved in the stress response. The other ones are anger, shame, and sadness or grief. So I'm going to give you one example of a common type of stress. So we humans, particularly women, tend to tie ourselves in knots, conforming to the perceived expectations of society to be the best mom, the best employee, the best wife, the most popular member of whatever club we're in, at the expense of our own needs and desires. Because thinking we might not be accepted is perceived by our brains as risking exile or death, it elicits the emotion shame. And shoots you right into this stress spiral again. And it's easy to see how we might become chronically stressed as we try to conform to the impossible expectations that we actually have of ourselves in all aspects of our lives. This is where habits like people-pleasing and perfectionism are the perfect setup for carrying chronic health-destroying stress through our adult lives. And it's the combined effects of the adrenaline and the cortisol that give you the ability to respond and survive an actual survival situation. But the more prolonged the stress and the more intense that physical reaction becomes. What does cortisol do? So cortisol, aside from being the master hormone, has many beneficial functions. It helps us stay alert and focused, allowing us to tackle whatever situation is at hand more effectively. It plays a huge role in regulating our sleep-wake cycle by cycling up and down through the day and night. It regulates our metabolism. In response to injury or infections, cortisol helps reduce inflammation and swelling in our bodies. This can aid in the healing process and protect us against further damage. And cortisol is necessary for life. If you don't have cortisol in your body, a stressful situation can literally kill you. But cortisol is the stress hormone, and it is used by your body to prioritize survival amongst all your other body functions. So it helps us route energy to functions that help us survive by raising your blood sugar. In addition to causing it from being dumped rapidly out of your liver into your bloodstream, it triggers a process called insulin resistance, which prevents glucose from being sucked up by non-essential functions like higher order thinking. So have you noticed how when you're really stressed, you can't think straight? Well, that's one reason why. Stress cortisol enables us to be focused and alert to danger by raising what's known as the sympathetic tone. And it shuts off functions that are not essential for immediate survival, like digestion, reproduction, growth, healing, immune surveillance, that are not essential. So hormones are controlled in our bodies by feedback loops that go through this primitive part of our brain called the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and then out to the body and then back again. And each hormone system has its own signal hormones from the pituitary, and these go out to the rest of the endocrine glands to tell them to get to work. So ACTH is for cortisol, TSH is for thyroid, FSH and LH are for sex hormones. So this system works in parallel to control a large list of our hormone systems with crosstalk amongst the systems, and under normal conditions, things stay in balance and all is well. The problem with our modern stress, beyond the fact that we frequently create it for ourselves, is that usually it's a pattern, a daily grind, a negative belief, even a habit like being late, for example, that creates chronic stress. And chronic stress hijacks the production of our other hormones through prioritizing survival. And also, that's also through crosstalk amongst the other hormone systems. So prolonged elevated cortisol signaling turns down the pituitary production of the other less essential hormones, like gonadotropins, which are these two, FSH and LH, like growth hormone, like ADH. And the result is that the production of those other helpful hormones slows down. So thyroid stimulating hormone in particular is suppressed by elevated cortisol and elevated ACTH. And low TSH lowers the production of thyroid hormone in your body. And thyroid hormone, of course, activates all your metabolism functions. And this makes sense because having an active metabolism is not as important as conserving energy in times of famine or illness. Reproduction is also a luxury function when your brain is signaling a survival situation, a waste of resources. Brain signaling for estradiol and testosterone in particular gets suppressed. If it was just about bringing babies into the world, we might not care about it quite as much, but slowdowns in those two hormones have widespread effects on your mood, on your well-being, and your other body processes. Aside from sexual performance, the overall result of losing these hormones is a loss of confidence, vitality, and performance ability. And loss of estradiol in particular promotes heart disease, stroke, depression, diabetes, inflammatory diseases like arthritis. But there are two more ways that high cortisol production can jack with your hormones. So here's one way. All the steroid hormones come from the raw material cholesterol. That's why they're called steroid or sterol hormones. So if we use the analogy of an assembly line in a car factory, then cholesterol is like the refined steel before it's shaped into parts. The first step in the manufacturing process is to turn the cholesterol into an intermediary step called pregnenolone. And pregnenolone would be like the rough parts before they're polished and finished. And this is the step that's ordered by ACTH in our brains. But if you look at the final output from our assembly line, there's 4 different finished hormone products that we can get from the raw materials, from the cholesterol. They are aldosterone and cortisol. And then on a sideline, we've got our estradiol and our testosterone. So these first 2 are both essential to life, but the cortisol is the most essential. But before we can get there, we have to make progesterone out of our pregnenolone. And progesterone is interesting because more than the other intermediate compounds, progesterone has very important hormone effects of its own, like maintaining a pregnancy. But it's also the building blocks, the finished parts, so to speak, for making all these other different kinds of cars or hormones. So if we're stressed, over time, overproduction of cortisol can actually become a supply chain issue because even if we had enough orders coming in to make the sex hormones, we don't have enough progesterone or raw material to fulfill all the orders for the cortisol and the aldosterone and have some left over for the testosterone and the estradiol because the progesterone is getting all used up to make the more essential hormones. And because of that, the production of the sex hormones can slow down or even stop. Irregular periods get really common. You've probably heard about how female athletes can stop having their periods while they're training really hard, and this is why. And even eventually aldosterone can be affected because even though it's essential, it's not as essential as cortisol for survival. And if it gets low, you get salt craving, low blood pressure, dizziness, and fainting spells. So here is a giant list of why it's so essential to proactively manage our stress responses, keeping cortisol down in the normal helpful range. So in addition to cutting off production of other hormones in the ways we just discussed, there are several direct effects of chronic elevated cortisol on other hormones and body systems. And if this response that was only supposed to be turned on long enough to help us get away from the tiger is now on all the time, that has some pretty profound consequences. So one of those consequences is belly fat, because cortisol is an anabolic steroid, but for fat, not for muscle. So if winter's coming, the more fat you have, the more you're likely to survive the winter. You're also, unfortunately, more likely to have heart disease, cancer, sleep apnea, and a whole host of other problems as a result of the obesity that results. So indigestion is not as minor as it sounds because cortisol changes your microbiome and slows down your digestion. It also removes healthy bacteria, makes you crave sugar, turns on your hunger hormones, and slows or stops the production of serotonin, the feel-good hormone. So cortisol shutting down your digestion can reduce serotonin by 80 to 90% because it comes from the lining of your gut when it's healthy. The result of cutting that off is depression. And then elevated blood pressure, we're going to mention this as well because higher blood pressure helps you when you're fighting, but chronic elevated blood pressure damages organs and blood vessels and is a huge independent risk factor for dementia as well as heart attacks and strokes. So we're also going to talk about thyroid hormone because this is a really biggie. We already said that high stress and high ACTH slows down thyroid stimulating hormone, reducing the production of thyroid hormone, but stressful situations and elevated cortisol also put the brakes on your thyroid function in a second way by slowing the conversion of thyroid hormone from the inactive T4 to the active form of T3, and also by making more reverse T3. So reverse T3 is a blocker of thyroid function in your cells. And the result is symptoms of hypothyroidism, which I discussed a lot in episode 3, but I'll just mention a few because weight loss resistance, fatigue, sleepiness, poor stamina, cold intolerance, sleep disturbances, memory problems, executive function problems, dry skin, brittle nails, and constipation are all thyroid symptoms. So starvation is one stress situation that actually comes to mind where this really makes sense. So in times when food was scarce, or when you were severely ill and you were not able to take in any food, it makes sense that your body would alter your thyroid function in order to conserve energy. So blocking T3 lowers your body's metabolic rate and slows the rate at which you burn up all your calories. Unfortunately, this is a big reason why calorie restriction as a weight loss strategy doesn't really work. So your body interprets that calorie restriction as starvation stress, even in someone who's obese. Thyroid problems as a result of blocked hormone conversion really can persist a long time after the stress is even removed. And of course, the ability to lose fat is only one of those negative consequences. One other thing about thyroid is that these kind of thyroid changes are typically the ones that don't show on the usual thyroid tests that doctors run. Takes a special set of tests to identify and devise a precise treatment plan to counteract what I call type 2 and treating this is actually the bulk of my medical practice these days. So I do actually want to drill into a couple more of these very important high cortisol effects. So one of the ways that high cortisol raises blood sugar is by triggering insulin resistance. And the result of that is that inactive muscle cells take up less glucose than we consume. This allows more glucose to be available for our active working muscles so we can fight or run, except for two things. First of all, it's chronic. Second of all, because we're not actually running from danger or even working our muscles in any meaningful way, we have to deal with all that extra sugar. So we produce extra insulin in order to keep up with blood sugars and keep them in the normal range. And long before we end up with the abnormal blood sugars, we're packing in the extra sugar as fat in our abdomens, livers, and organs because of those very high insulin levels that are needed to deal with that extra sugar. And excess fatty infiltration from the high insulin and high insulin demand eventually overwhelm the pancreas, which can't secrete enough insulin, and then your blood sugars rise, and that's the definition of diabetes. And the high blood sugar creates its own list of damages, but high insulin levels themselves have a laundry list of harmful effects. So high insulin promotes the storage of excess calories when calories are plentiful, especially in the presence of fructose. It makes you crave more sugar, eat more calories, saps your energy, and generally does everything possible to make sure you don't burn up your precious fat stores. Because excess calories are now actually available year-round, the result is obesity. So stress makes you fat, and it keeps you fat in more ways than one. And chronic insulin levels also feed forward to raise your cortisol level even higher. So one more effect of high cortisol is elevated sympathetic tone. And I need to define sympathetic tone because it has nothing to do with sympathy. This refers to the two different and opposite parts of our involuntary nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system revs us up for fighting or running away and makes us vigilant for danger. That's fight or flight. Parasympathetic is the more relaxed part that helps our bodies digest food, heal, grow, other non-survival tasks. So that's the rest and digest. So if we have elevated sympathetic tone, that is a new baseline state that keeps your body ready for action even when you're not consciously aware of any threats. So this results in anxiety, difficulty sleeping, hypertension, and fluctuations in blood sugar due to the repeated dumping of adrenaline, which raises blood sugar after insulin lowers it. So brain signaling to the adrenals for increased acute cortisol production stays high for days after an acute event. A modern example of how this works would be like how you don't sleep well when you know your kid is sick. And it takes time to resolve after the stressor has passed. So that elevated sympathetic tone can also get chronic too. And chronic elevated sympathetic tone is really bad because that results in anxiety, insomnia, hypertension, increased heart disease, reduced heart rate variability, heart failure, and even ulcers. So if the stress is ongoing, then that's when we start seeing elevated sympathetic tone getting stuck in that chronic hyperalert anxious state. And then one last thing is that chronic elevated stress results in changes in your immune system. In favor of fighting inflammation, you get reduced infection fighting and cancer fighting, just like taking a shot of steroids or a Medrol pack would do. But this shift leaves you susceptible to allergies and autoimmune diseases and cancer, which is just really swapping one kind of inflammation for another kind. So the final way that chronically high stress can affect our bodies happens when the demand for cortisol exceeds the capacity of the adrenals to make enough. So think about our assembly line again. It's producing the cortisol day and night, and eventually the tools start to wear out and the factory has to go to reduce capacity. And the more stress we endure, the more we overuse our adrenals, and the longer and harder they work, the more depleted they get. And when the adrenals can't produce enough to meet our basic needs, we get real problems. So what happens when the cortisol levels drop is that rapid-acting adrenaline becomes the dominant stress hormone. And this produces even more anxiety due to repeated and chronic overstimulation. This level of anxiety gets chronic. And anxiety worsens sensitivity to pain, which, guess what, produces even more stress. So you can see how people could get stuck in this spiral of stress, high cortisol, high adrenaline, more pain, less serotonin, because remember I said your gut's offline, not producing serotonin, and then be unable to break out without supplementation, therapy, drugs, coaching, or other deliberate techniques to help you manage your stress. So this is what I thought of immediately when I read what happened to Martha Beck. She said in the book, sort of jokingly, that she had to take a whole year off to do not much but lay on the couch in order to get over it. And I still think she was probably one of the lucky ones, because some people don't find a way out. And some of the named disorders that have this not enough cortisol issue as a hallmark are chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and PTSD, which are characteristic of burnout. All right, so why does the cortisol production drop? Well, eventually your adrenals run out of raw materials. These are necessary nutrients like vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and more. And after a while, the body can't even make a normal amount of the steroid precursors, and the reserves drop, and finally we actually see low measurable cortisol values on a blood test. And interestingly, both too much cortisol and not enough cortisol can give you lots of similar symptoms. And the main overarching theme there is the loss of ability to handle stress, exhaustion after mild exertion, weakness, fainting, dizziness, salt craving, mood changes, emotional disturbances, increased perception of pain, anxiety, depression, joint and muscle pain, overall loss of appetite, and really just overall the inability to handle any stress. And this can show up really early. So for Martha Beck, she was 18, she said, when this happened. For myself, it was also very early, in my teen years. For most folks, maybe mid-30s. But people who end up with these severe consequences in their later years can often pinpoint telltale symptoms from 20 years or so previous. And for women, occasionally, everything stays pretty much under control until they start approaching perimenopause. And then the loss of estrogen starts promoting the insulin resistance, and all these issues start to emerge. That said, I am a big proponent of hormone replacement in perimenopause and menopause, but that does not fix the stress. So what do you want to look for? Well, cravings, mood changes, bowel problems, dry skin, hair loss, fatigue, exercise intolerance, acne on your back and arms, sensitive teeth, bleeding gums, weight gain, especially in the belly area. So it is really never too late to start taking care of yourself. So there are a few things you can do. At this point, if things are feeling a little too familiar and you're wondering what you can do about stopping this stress spiral, I have a list of what I call the daily stress care essentials. And those are optimization of sleep, getting 7 to 8 hours of regular sleep a night. Mindfulness, meditation, prayer, hobbies where you use your hands. It gets you off of the past or the future. And then mindset, where you literally consciously change how you think about your circumstances and maybe rethink what you're doing so that you're meeting your own expectations and not everyone else's. And then maybe working on changing your habits like people pleasing or procrastination or perfectionism. And in this way, I strongly do recommend Martha Beck's book, The Way of Integrity, or pick your own favorite life coach and follow their podcasts and work their system. And then the next one is movement, and that's exercise. And I don't mean high stress cardio. I mean yoga, tai chi, brisk walking, dance, and then heavy weightlifting is really helpful to build muscle mass and reduce the effects of insulin resistance. And then the final one is nutrition. And that's clean water, no using plastic to hold your food, reducing or eliminating sweets and processed food, particularly carbs. Eat the rainbow, fresh vegetables, plenty of fiber and protein. And in summary, what you're doing really is proactively working to lower your stress levels. And I'm not talking about a shopping spree or a spa day that help you do those, because what we need to do is lower your sympathetic tone. And that's what this list of stuff does. So you might be thinking, wait a minute, now I just don't have the energy to work out or to meal prep or get a hobby or get a coach. And this is the dilemma that many of my patients tend to face. And some people's bodies need a little extra help. And there are specific supplements that I recommend, vitamins, minerals, nutrients, and in particular order and in particular timing and amounts that can help you optimize your adrenal function while you're working to do better on managing your stress, not suppress it. This is an important caveat because there are lots of providers out there of various types of health coaching who will advise you to use powerful plant-based phytopharmaceuticals that can suppress your adrenal glands. And I do not recommend these plants because for the reasons I just explained about what happens when you cannot make enough cortisol. So if you're interested in my supplements recommendations, you can find that on my website at www.danagibbsmd.com/guide. And for your information, I don't sell supplements. I don't get a kickback if you buy anything I recommend. All right, that's all I've got for you today. And there will be more details next time on Beyond the Thyroid. Bye, y'all. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Thyroid. If you found this information valuable, it would mean so much to me if you'll take a few seconds and give the podcast a 5-star review. It helps other people who need this information find the show, and it's really easy. Just search and click on the name of the show, Beyond the Thyroid, and scroll to the bottom to ratings and reviews. I truly do read and appreciate every one. Remember, when it comes to hormones, there will always be more to discover. So follow the show so you get the next episode as soon as it's released. And if you or someone you care about needs a caring doctor to help figure out how to heal hormone problems that other doctors have dismissed, check out my website at www.danagibbsmd.com. And if you're not a physician, please keep in mind, while I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. The content of this podcast is my opinion, and it's for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is not meant to be individual medical advice, and you should consult your own physician for any medical issues or diagnoses that you may have. I look forward to continuing this journey with you beyond the thyroid.